Hey everyone, George here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be talking about pH. This is a topic that I've been wanting to cover for a while because I get a lot of questions about what pHs I'm running in my water and what effects do the hardscape, wood, fish, and all plants and whatever you might have in your tank, how do they affect the pH? When we come back, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to cover some pretty thorough information here that may give you some ideas on how pH affects your tanks and whether or not you should be concerned about it. Hang in there with me, and we'll be right back. So when we're talking about pH, we're talking about the difference between a low pH, which would be water that is considered acidic, and different things will affect that, or we are talking about water that is alkaline, which is also affected by many different things. Now, the concern that people have when they talk to me about pH is, what should the pH be in my water that is ideal for the fish that I am trying to keep? And the answer to that is simple in many cases, and in other cases it's very difficult. So let's take a couple examples here. I raise a lot of discus fish, so when I'm raising discus fish, the biggest concern would be is, what is your pH? The lower the pH, the more acidic the water, the softer the water, the better for the fish. And that seems to be the biggest question that I get, is what do you run your pH at? Now, I have never really gotten into worrying about pH for any of my fish, simply because most fish are adaptable to pHs unless they're just outrageously finicky type fish, or if they're outrageously off the charts messed up as far as the pH goes. And the reason for that would be simply because of how you're either hardscaping your tank, the type of water that you're using. Sometimes you don't have any choice and you're using water right out of your tap, or you're using RO water, which gives you a lot of control, and those kinds of things. So let's clarify this a little bit so we get a better understanding of how important pH would be for discus as an example. Now, discus are raised in lots of different types of pH situations, and I don't worry too much about that. I find out what the pH is when I buy my fish, who I get them from. I get an idea, and what I try to do is make sure that my pH doesn't fluctuate, because a fluctuating pH is more deadly or more concerning than a stable pH. If you have a stable pH, most of your discus fish are going to probably adapt to that, unless they are wild discus fish. And this is important to note, that wild discus fish versus tank raised hybrids that are all over the board with pHs, anywhere from 7.5 all the way up to 8.8 I've seen, as far as how pHs go. So what I would tell you is this: do not be as concerned with a hybrid discus fish about your pH levels as you are with a wild discus fish, which is much more important, because wild discus fish come from pHs that are rather low. Water is more acidic, it's softer, and there is a huge difference between a wild discus pH requirements and those of a hybrid who have been raised in tanks and just simply adjust to the pH. So if you are getting hybrid discus fish, I would tell you that as long as your pH is stable, and this has some things to do with not only the water that you're using. If you're using the same water all the time, your pH is probably going to be the same all the time. The things that will affect that, however, is how many fish you have in that tank, if you're overpopulating it, the types of rocks that you're using. For example, the harder the harder to control the pH would be as if you are doing a lot of things that kind of run outside the norm. If you are using whatever type of rock for your discus fish, they're probably going to be just fine as long as that pH is basically the same whenever you take a pH measurement, and you're coming up with the same numbers every time. Discus are very resilient to lower or higher pHs, and it's because they've basically been kept and raised in a environment where they have been tank raised. And again, as I said, the most important thing is to have a stable pH. Now, again, there are so many different things can affect pH, and huge changes in your tank as far as population of your fish, or the types of hardscape that you're putting in there, all kinds of different things going on with the water changes that you're doing. All of these things can affect your pH over time, and if you are building a tank based on a pH for your discus fish that you know is going to be a certain number, and you have no intentions of purposefully messing around with that pH by doing different things over time, then your fish will gradually adapt to that pH. Now, this is not for every fish out there, and discus I'm talking about because they're probably the most significant fish that will have trouble with pH than all of your other fish that you might be getting. For example, tetras all come from various parts of South America. Water is very similar in the tributaries and rivers that surround the Amazon. So the water is basically pretty acidic, and the pHs run rather lower. And so you want to try to look and see what the pH is at the supplier, and see what they've either tank raised those fish in with a pH of, for example, let's just say they're raising cardinal tetras in a pH that's around 7.6 to 7.8. If you were to have a situation where the cardinal tetras all of a sudden are coming from either supplier to your either your tank at home, or if you have a gallery and you're using them all over the place, the water is going to be the same unless you are changing the type of rocks that you're using. And of course, those kinds of things will have an effect on those pH. But tetras, for example, I've seen anywhere from 7.6 up to 8.2 do rather well and not have any problems at all with pH. Now, does this affect their long-term health? Yes, it can. It is something that, just like we, for example, if we were sitting in a room and we don't smoke, but we had people in the room that were smoking, and we were breathing in secondhand smoke, and that's not something that we're used to, and all of a sudden we're thrown into that environment, we're not going to do very well with that, simply because we're not used to it. It's not a stable environment that we're familiar with. And the same thing with fish. If you get fish that are at a 7.6 pH and you bring them home and you're at 7.9 or 8.2 or whatever, it's probably not going to be a huge problem for those tetras, but it could reduce the lifespan of the fish over time. So you want to try to pick fish for your area that are going to do well with your tap water, if that's what you're using. If you have an RO system where you can regulate that, and you have done your homework and you are picking hardscapes that are going to help buffer that pH and make it a softer water. A good example of that would be people using limestones or softer stones and stuff like that. That is obviously going to soften the water, but you want to scape your tank how you want your tank to look. I try to scape tanks based on the area in which the fish come from, so it is a little bit more of a natural environment. Sand has a lot to do with pH and the balance of the pH, as opposed to let's say gravel, or let's say substrates that you can pick, such as fluval has several different substrates out there. There's all kinds of companies that make substrates, and you just have to know how those substrates are going to affect your fish long term. And this gets us back to the original thing we talked about in the last video, and that is making sure the number one thing is that you cycle your tank and that you are getting a constant reading of the same types of readings on pH and hardness of water and those sorts of things, because those are going to be important as to the types of fish that you might choose for the kind of community tank that you're going to put together. Now, this gets me back to another thing. If you're picking fish that all have different requirements in pH, and you're picking them from all over the place, and you're trying to mix those fish together, that's not something that I recommend. Now, it's something you can do. It's a little trickier, but most people are able to do this and pull it off. And I find, however, that some fish don't do as well long term as they would on a short term basis. So again, do your homework before you decide what kind of tank that you want. Now, if you know absolutely up front the kind of fish that you are going to put in that tank, it's really important that you do your homework and make sure that what you're putting together is really something that I would suggest is very native to the natural environment in which these fish would live in the wild. Just because they're tank raised doesn't mean that a pH that is ideal for the area in which they come from doesn't mean that you can play around with the pH and adapt those fish dramatically with wild and crazy high or low pHs. And you have to understand that one of the main things that pH has to do with is that H in your pH means hydrogen. And why does hydrogen have an effect on the pH in your water? Because the more fish that you have in your tank, the more overpopulated you make your tank, that H is going to turn hydrogen into ammonia and throw your tank off. So these are things that you have to pay attention to. So having said that, I hope that clarifies a little bit of an understanding on how pH works. I'm not trying to hold these seminars on one particular thing, but I wanted to pick out a few things in the next few videos before we get to this tank here and we do a big build on it and we talk about it, because I think there's some misnomers out there that a lot of people who are fish keepers that are beginners, they don't understand how some of this stuff works, and perhaps you don't care, and you're not somebody who's worried about how well your fish are going to do long term, And I would tell you this, for those kinds of people, there's no point in even watching a video like this, because if you're not going to understand how all of these things, ammonia, nitrites, nitrates, pH, how they all affect your tank, then there's no point in even watching this video, because it's simply not something that is going to make a difference to you anyway. You are probably going to disregard this information and just do what you want to do. And that's fine, because if that's the way you feel about it, I have seen people do very well ignoring a lot of these things, but I have also seen people go through a lot of difficulty, stress, and anxiety because they didn't do their homework and they didn't understand the requirements of the types of fish that they were putting in their tanks, of what their needs might be in their natural environment or in their tank environment. And I think that that's wrong to do, because even though your fish look like they might be healthy, their life is being degraded slowly by problems with, let's say, just crazy pHs that are off the charts, or pHs that are so low that it doesn't make sense for those fish in the long term. So I hope that this information will help you to understand a little bit more about how pH affects your tank, and whether or not it should be something that you're paying a lot of attention to. I think there are 4 things, as I said in my last video. If you haven't watched that, I will put a link down below here for you to go right to that particular video. You'll see that up at the top. Now, actually, I think it's on this side over here. You'll see that video come up and give you an opportunity to watch that video as well and get a little more of an understanding, if you're serious about this, about what you should be concerned about and what you shouldn't be concerned about. Now, like I said, with discus fish, if I have wild discus, yes, I'm going to be concerned about the type of water that they are in, and I am going to try to adjust that pH level to something that is as close to their natural environment as I possibly can. And that probably is going to require RO water and those sorts of things, where you're taking a lot of the minerals out and the water is a little bit more acidic. And this is the type of environment that these fish like. Wild fish are different than tank-raised fish. Tank-raised fish are fish that have been in the same environment their whole lives, and the only thing that you require with a pH with them is not something that's crazy up or crazy down, but somewhere in the middle. They will adjust just fine if they are a hybrid discus fish, because they have probably been raised in a pH that is not normal to a discus environment in the wild anyway. So you might want to talk to your supplier and get a reading on what their pH is and see how close you can come to that. But again, the most important thing is stability of pH, and that means being careful not to do a lot of ridiculous things like overpopulating your tank, overfeeding your fish, not doing enough water changes and those sorts of things, because as I said, the H in pH is hydrogen, and hydrogen turns into ammonia when it is ignored, and that becomes a problem. That is something that your fish will not tolerate over time. Test your water. Make sure that you have an understanding of how well you're doing with your water, and make sure that you understand that if you need to make some adjustments, do your homework and figure out what you can do to either lower or balance your pH. A neutral is right around 7. If you can get to neutral on the pH, that's probably good for most fish, and your fish will do just fine. But if you have expensive fish that you are raising, you want to pay a little bit of attention to the pH and just make sure that it's stable. And stability means that you're not making a lot of crazy changes to your tank as far as rescaping it all the time, changing the environment in a way where, because plants just, for example, I've had friends that have gone to a non-planted tank, and all of a sudden their pH is way off, and they're like, what's going on with that? Well, plants use the organics that are in your water, and they keep your ammonia levels down and things like that. Well, it's the same thing with pH. If you take something out or add something to your tank, you are definitely going to affect the pH in some way. So again, be careful to pay attention to these things a little bit. They're not life-threatening right away to your fish, but they can, as I said, degrade the lifespan of your fish over time. Discus fish can last in a tank for up to 15. I've seen friends that have actually had discus for up to 17 years, which is on the higher end of a lifespan. But it's all because they've been very careful to make sure that they haven't done wild swings in their pH and other things in their tank. So just be careful and understand that the pH is not crazily important unless you are doing things that are constantly moving the dial on your pH and causing your fish to have extreme changes in that. If you've got a stable pH and your fish are doing well in there, you don't know how long they're going to live. I don't know how long they're going to live, but I would tell you this: a stable pH is better than having a pH that's all over the place. And that comes with paying attention and, like I said, taking some tests now and then. I like to test my water for pH about once a month just to make sure, and basically I never really see any major swings at all. My discus are living just fine in 7.8 pH water, and they do fantastic. Well, thank you for watching today. I hope that I helped you with questions regarding pH, because as I said, it's not hugely important to worry about pHs that are a little high and or a little bit low. Again, it's all about stability for the most part, and stability is just something you're going to have to work on, and that is something that comes from understanding your tank and the environment in which you're putting your fish. So again, do your homework. Thanks for joining me today. Hit that bell up there so you get a notification every time I have a video coming out. And also, if you would do me a favor, give me a thumbs up on it, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll try to get back to you within 24 hours, and also share with your friends. That's how the channel is being built, basically. And again, I've said this a million times in the 400 and something videos that I have made on this channel. I am not doing this as a way to make a living, because I don't do this for a living. I keep fish because it's a hobby of mine, and I absolutely love keeping fish. I love decorating and hardscaping tanks to be beautiful and to be as natural as they possibly can be. And as I said, we're going to be doing something with this tank here over the next few months that's going to give us a chance to let wild discus be in here. And it may not even be the same tank. We're going to use this area, is what I'm saying, for a tank that is going to be used for wild discus raising. And I'm trying to get all the materials that I can, but in the environment that we're in right now in the world, it's just been harder to get all that stuff. I'm close, and I'm hoping that within the next few weeks to a month, I'm able to start the process of changing this whole environment behind me to something that I think is probably going to be one of the best tanks that I've ever built. So thank you again for joining me today. I hope you'll join me on the next one. Any videos that you have not seen of mine, if you're looking for a particular topic, go through my videos. I've probably covered it at one time or another, but I thought today pH was a good question to answer for people who seem to want to know that a lot, because I raise discus, they raise discus, and again, wild discus, a little more concerning. Hybrid discus that have been tank raised, not so much concerning about the pH, but again, neither should be in a tank where you're having wild swings in your pH, because that is not a healthy environment for discus or any other kind of fish. So stability in pH is everything. Thanks for joining me today. We will see you on the next one. Until then, thank you, and we'll see you again.